Okay, I think we have a quorum, so let's get started. I want to make sure we have enough time for Rebecca as well as questions. I'm excited to have Rebecca Miller with us today. She has been one of my go-to people over the last couple of years as I've tried to come up to speed in wildfire research. So a big thank you to her for educating me and teaching me along the way as she's patiently answered many questions and provided connections for me. If you aren't aware, she recently defended her PhD dissertation and has spent the last several years unraveling the complexities of how governments and communities prepare for, respond to, and recover from wildfires. And today she's going to speak to us about trends in California wildfire-related legislature from the past 2 decades. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Rebecca.
Great. Well, I will share screen. Does that work? You can all see that? Perfect. Fantastic. All right. Today I'm going to be talking about some of the trends in California's wildfire legislation over the past 2 decades, as Derek said, from 2001 to 2020. This is an ongoing collaboration between me and then 2 other PhD students, Ini Iper, Lin Shi, and Karen Chawa, as well as Catherine Mock from the University of Miami. If you have questions, feel free to jump in and ask them. I'm really looking for some feedback on this, and I'm excited to present it to you. Oops. All right. So a little bit of introduction and background is that to really understand how wildfire policies are being proposed in California and to understand how the legislature is responding, we have to recognize that the legislature follows a different calendar than we might be used to. They follow a 2-year legislative calendar for each session. This is a really simplified version of that calendar. But generally speaking, the calendar starts on September 1st of even numbered years and runs for 2 full years, ending on August 31st of the next even numbered year. The legislative session is split into 2 years, each of which has a relatively short window to introduce bills. That window ends in around mid-February each year. And then there's a longer period in which bills can be passed when committees can debate the bills and vote on them to move them forward or not. And this matters because when we talk about wildfires, when the wildfire occurs might influence which legislative session it's being talked about in. So for example, the Sonoma Complex fires took place in October 2017, which meant that they took place in year 2 of the 2017 to 2018 legislative session. So the legislature could respond to these fires with legislation during essentially the same time, 2017, that these fires happened. But when we think about something like the Camp Fire, that took place in November 2018, which meant that it actually took place in year 1 of the 2019 to 2020 legislative session. So legislators are responding not necessarily to the calendar year, but to what they've already experienced within their own time frame. So we're really used to seeing graphs that look like this one, which show the number of structures destroyed in blue and the number of acres burned in red by the calendar year. And I'll draw your attention particularly to 2020, where we had a record-breaking number of acres burned in 2020. But we have to take graphs like this, and then we turn them into something that looks like this. So this is what the legislature would be thinking about along these same metrics: structures destroyed and acres burned. It's a really different calendar. It's 2 years for the legislative session. And I told you to look out for 2020, actually 3.5 million acres burned in 2020 after the session ended on August 31st, which is why on this graph, it only looks like there were 1.5 million acres burned, still quite a bit, but not the 4 million acres that actually burned throughout the full 2020 year. But the legislature is responding to these bills, or to these wildfires rather. We've seen more bills with the keyword wildfire proposed in just the last few legislative sessions, likely in response to these severe wildfires we've been experiencing. So this shows the number of structures destroyed and acres burned overlaid on the number of bills with the keyword wildfire that passed in the darker brown and failed in the lighter beige. And you might notice that 2019 to 2020 was a particularly high year for wildfire bills that were proposed. But sometimes politicians just include the word wildfire in the bill, and actually 31% of these bills had absolutely nothing specific to do with disasters. I read through all of these bills and removed those, and even when we get rid of the bills that just threw the word wildfire in for whatever reason, but weren't actually about wildfires, we still see a huge increase in legislative or legislative interest in these wildfire bills. And I wanted to understand, first, why the legislature is paying attention to this, what factors might be influencing their increased attention to this, and also to dig a little bit more into these bills themselves. So the first step to that was trying to understand what might be influencing the legislature. And I thought about 4 main metrics for how that we use for wildfires. The number of wildfires each legislative session, the number of fatalities in the session, the number of structures that were destroyed in the session, and the number of acres burned in the session. And I found that only the number of structures destroyed influenced how many bills were being put forth each year. So the legislature seems to be responding to destruction more than fatalities or the size of these wildfires. But none of those factors affected the pass rate of the bills, or essentially why any of these bills were passing or failing in numbers. So I wanted to understand what affected the success rate. So in this research study, my 2 research questions are, first, what are the topics of California's wildfire-related bills? I used a keyword search to find the wildfire bills within the state legislature, and we can use keywords to search for things like prescribed burns or defensible space, but that also kind of assumes that we know what we're looking for. And there might be topics in here that the wildfire bills are about that we're not thinking of off the top of our heads. So the first thing I wanted to do was understand what the bills were about. And then second, I wanted to look into what factors might influence whether the bill passed or failed. And I've got about 6 hypotheses here, which I'll go through in the presentation, but I was looking at the sponsor of the bill and whether the bill's sponsor made a difference and whether it passed or failed. The legislative procedures, like which committees reviewed the bill, whether that made a difference, the stage of the disaster, like mitigation, preparedness, response relief, etc. The affected population, like whether the bill was about a specific location or a specific population. The topic of the bill, whether what the bill was about made a difference. And then this idea, which I'm really hoping to get some feedback on to help pursue this research, is if at first you don't succeed, try again. That multiple iterations of the bills will result in a higher pass rate potentially than a one-off bill alone. So I'm gonna present some of my methods. I'm sort of assuming that this audience is familiar with topic modeling. So I'm gonna do a really quick overview of what we did for topic modeling, but if you're not familiar with topic modeling, please just let me know and I'm happy to explain all of this in greater detail. But I'm hoping that this simplistic overview will get you there either way. So the first thing that we did was we gathered and we cleaned all of the summary text from all of the wildfire related bills. It was 294 bills. What we did was we took the text that you see on the left, which came from a website, and we turned it into a text file like you see on the right. We got rid of all of the draft language that wasn't included in the final version of the bill. So you see on the left areas in red that are crossed out. We removed all of that language and only looked at the final language from the bill. After that, we transformed the bill text into something called a bag of words, which essentially counts up how many times each word appears within the text. So we took the text from the left, put it into this bag of words, and it comes out with this sense of how many times these words are used. So even just looking at the frequency of the word count, we can kind of get an idea about what this bill is about. It's talking about penalties and fines and violations and criminal activity. And in fact, if we read what the bill is about, it's called Violations, Penalties and Fines, Wildfire Incidents. So it kind of is sort of clear from the words themselves what this bill might generally be about. And we take those bag of words and we run a topic model on the bill text to allow natural language processing to sort the words into themes, which means that we take all of those bags of words, and I've given 4 sort of sample bags on the left, and we allow the computer through AI to sort them for us. So we look at things like the first bill, which has the words like vegetative, forester, crown, fuel break, biomass, truck, car. And those words are about both transportation and they're also about fuel treatments. But then we look at the second one and it's rail, truck, transportation, commuter, and those are all about transportation. And so we kind of automatically sort these different words into groups that match up, and then we can name the topics based on the words that are sorted into them. What this actually looks like is a graph or an image like this. It's an inner topic distance map or like a bubble graph. And the words that you see on the right are the top words within the topics. And so we can also highlight individual topics. Like here, I've highlighted topic 14. Sorry, the text is pretty small, but some of the most common terms here are things like rail, hybrid, intercity, transportation, commuter, truck, smog. These are words that are a lot about transportation. And so we can take these words and start to identify the words that might form around each one of these topics. Once we identify the words that are associated with all of these different topics, we can search for individual bills that include at least 2 of these most frequent words. The idea is, does the bill contain specific words about transportation that come from the text, like rail, intercity, hybrid, etc.? And are these words available at least twice to make sure that the bill really is about that topic? And we looked at each one of these bills to see whether they matched up to these words. And we found, for example, AB 1167 on the top, that's about Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, high-speed rail, forestry, and fire protection. This is a bill that takes money from the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, specifically for a high-speed rail project, to hire new firefighters and buy new firefighting equipment. It's very clearly about transportation, and it's also very clearly about wildfires. So this matches into that transportation category. But then the bill on the bottom is about personal income taxes, fire safe home tax credits. There's nothing to do with transportation and wouldn't be matched into that topic through this process. Once we identify those different bills that fall into the topics, we can identify, we can kind of sort those out. So here is a graph that shows all of the bills in our corpus with the transportation bills highlighted. You might notice there's not a lot of bills that fall into that transportation category. It's not really surprising. Some of these categories are really small, but these words kept coming up over and over and over again, which indicates the topic itself is very clear, even if it's not a very large topic. So once we had identified the topics, after that, we coded all kinds of basic bill information on the sponsors and the purpose of the bill to start identifying what factors might influence whether those bills passed or failed. And those included things related to the sponsor, like the political party, the legislative history of the sponsor, as well as the district they came from, and specifically whether it had experienced a recent wildfire. We looked at things like co-sponsorship and bipartisan sponsorship. We considered legislative procedures like committee review, the stage of the disaster, mitigation, preparedness, etc. We looked at whether the bill was a holiday or memorial bill, like Wildfire Preparedness Week. We looked at if it focused on a disadvantaged or vulnerable population and called a specific population out or didn't call any population out, whether it focused on a specific geographic area, and then also on the topic of the bill. So if that, there's also a couple of limitations to this process. First off, these bills aren't the same length. The bill that you see on the left is 1 sentence long, and the bill that you see on the right is much longer, and it's actually fairly short compared to some of the other bills in here, but they both count as bills in our corpus, and but one of them obviously just has much more data because it's a longer bill. And also, and I'll get to this a little bit later as well, a lot of these bills can share the same language. So these are 2 bills that were proposed, both of them failed, and I've highlighted the language that's identical between the 2 bills. And these each are going to count as separate bills in our analysis, but they're really just the same information being put through the topic model twice. So we're sort of double counting some of these in some cases to understand what these bills are about. All right. Are there any questions on that before I jump into the actual results of the bills? Any questions on
Rebecca,
the topic model? Yeah.
I have one. So you should have those 2 bills back to back. Is it pretty clear that they just copied and pasted, or is the second one or first one a revision of the first?
So that's actually something I'm going to get to, which is one of the things that I would like help with, is kind of in understanding a little bit better how to track revisions of these bills, because we don't necessarily want to, if one of the bills fails and then it gets proposed again and it passes with revised language, maybe that should be applauded or recognized as a benefit or something, instead of viewed again as or looking even at the first one as a failure. Yeah.
Great, thanks.
Yeah. All right. So the bill topics themselves. So we did this topic model, and we ended up identifying 29 topics from the topic model. Again, there's 294 bills here. These are listed in order of size. So what this says is that the largest topic in the group was fuels management. There were 87 bills in that topic. They had a 36% success rate. We also found number 30, none. 36 bills had no topics. That's also not very surprising. Some of them were about totally unique topics, like the pet safety bill, which I showed you a little earlier, the one sentence bill. None of the other bills are about pet safety. So that one's in a standalone category by itself. But I'll give you a second to look over this list. All right. So another way to look at this is with this graph. Anybody who has suggestions for how to make this easier to read, be very appreciative of that. But this looks at the percentage of each legislative session that's composed of those different topics. We can sort of trace these topics and their growth or shrinking over time. So for example, the very bottom topic, I don't know if you can see my mouse, but the kind of burnt orange topic at the bottom, that's fuels management, which is the largest topic. And you can see that though it remains one of the largest throughout, it does experience a dip over time as other topics start to emerge, including things like some of the other large topics like electric transmission, de-energization and public safety power shutoffs, homeowners insurance, which becomes a bigger issue in recent years. And so more of these topics are coming out, and the priorities of the legislature seem to be shifting in response to new issues. A lot of the most common bills most common topics rather, are about mitigation, specifically about fuels and utilities management. So if we look at the top 7 categories of the bills, a lot of them are about making sure that fires don't start by doing things like de-energization or undergrounding infrastructure, or they're about mitigating some of the effects of that, like dealing with the impacts of public safety power shutoffs, or even just removing fuels entirely, like the very first topic is about fuels management. And a lot of the topics we find are clustered by specific year. So for example, the second largest topic is electric transmission. 77% of the bills that fall into that topic came out in 2019 to 2020. 82% of the bills about de-energization and power shutoffs came out in 2019 to 2020. Unsurprisingly, all of the bills related to the COVID-19 pandemic came out in the same year. But again, it shows that we're not only seeing more bills being proposed most recently, but we're also seeing new interest from the legislature in particular moments to be dealing with the disasters happening right now related to things like public safety power shutoffs. And some of these topics appear really infrequently. Less than 5% of the corpus is composed of some of these bills. But again, some of them like transportation, they're still present in the group of bills that we look at. They're just not necessarily very prevalent, but they should still be recognized as something that the legislature is paying attention to. And most of these bills match into more than one topic. So about 12% of the bills match into no topics, 20% match into a single topic, and all the rest of them match into 2 or more topics. And what you can often see is a really long bill that might actually be about 7 different things, all smushed together. And that bill might be an all-encompassing bill, or it might be a bill that kind of took pieces from other bills and created this big omnibus bill. But we do see some diversity in how many topics there are. So at this point, I'm going to switch over to talk more a little bit about how these bills pass or fail and what factors might be affecting that, and what we can even say about whether they pass or fail. So the first thing that we looked at, we had 6 hypotheses again. The first hypothesis was that the bill's sponsor might influence the passage. And to read this graph, I'll just explain it very quickly. This means that Republicans proposed 104 bills with a 31% pass rate. Democrats proposed 181 bills with a 40% pass rate. So here we looked at the political party of the sponsor, whether the bill had bipartisan sponsorship or partisan sponsorship, whether it was co-sponsored or not co-sponsored, whether it was a female or male legislator, whether the legislator came from the Senate or the Assembly, an urban or a rural district, whether the legislator had had a recent wildfire in the district. And we determined that that would be a fire of at least 500 acres, in which at least 10% was located in the district within the previous 2 legislative sessions. So fairly recent memory and a significant fire of some size. And then the average number of, or the total number of sessions the legislator had served in the legislature, with the sense that more experienced legislators might be better at getting bills passed. And we found that only 2 of these factors made a difference, whether it was a Republican or a Democrat. Republicans did worse, and whether the bill was co-sponsored or not. And co-sponsored bills, to my surprise, did worse. And having a recent wildfire in the district or even experience in the legislature were not significant to influencing the passage of these bills. We next looked at legislative procedures to see what those impacts might be. We considered urgency measures. So urgency measures have a higher threshold to pass the legislature. You need 2/3 of the legislature in both houses to pass the bill for it to be implemented immediately, as opposed to in the next session starts. And we also looked separately at the number of committees that were reviewing the bill, from 0 committees to 6 committees, and also the number of committees that were reviewing the bill from 1 to 6. It's sort of the assumption that if no committee is looking at your bill, you have a very low chance of getting it passed. And we found that urgency measures had no impact, but the number of committees reviewing the bill does have an impact. And the more committees look at the bill, the higher the likelihood is that your bill would pass. We also looked at the individual.
Rebecca?
Oh, yes, sorry.
I guess I might be a little denser. I'm trying to understand the difference between your 0 to 6 versus
Yes.
1 to 6.
So I counted how many committees reviewed the bills. And some of these bills died before they ever were seen by a single committee. And so I was counting, if a bill died before making it to any committee, that would be a 0. But we sort of assume, in fact, I think only 2 of the 50-something bills that were seen by no committees passed. So I also wanted to consider whether being seen by any committee at all would make a difference in this. So it's looking at the maximum number of committees that looked at these bills, which was 6, and considering the committees that, or considering the bills that both saw no committees, and looking separately at only the bills that went to at least 1 committee. Does that make more sense?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay,
Thank
perfect.
you.
Sorry. So then we looked at the actual committees themselves. So we looked at both Assembly and Senate committees, and kind of grouped them together as best we could. So for example, if a bill went to the Appropriations Committee in either the Senate or the Assembly, as 180 bills did, that counted under appropriations overall. And so we grouped these together. As I said, 58 of these bills saw no committee and had only a 2% success rate, number 25. And we looked at all of these and found that there were a couple of committees that seemed to maybe make a difference, but the sample size was also tiny. 2 bills went through the Health Committee and had a 100% success rate. I don't think that that's the key to getting a wildfire bill passed. But it does seem like when no committee reviews your bill, you have a pretty low chance of getting it passed. And that didn't really seem to work. Third, we looked at whether the stage of the disaster might influence the passage. And here we were talking about, we coded all these bills to be about mitigation, preparedness, response, relief, long-term recovery, and then this other category of smoke and air pollution, which fit into about 10 of these bills overall. And we found that most of the bills focus on mitigation. So mitigation is shown here in the purple. Obviously, it was the primary topic in 2019 to 2020, but it's also the most common throughout all of the different legislative sessions. Politicians seem to be really focusing on preventing wildfires from happening, though there is some attention being paid to post-disaster as well in the red and the gray in this relief or long-term recovery. There's the least amount of attention paid to smoke and air pollution related bills. And we found that when we looked at the different stages, as well as when we looked at if these bills were talking about multiple different stages of a disaster, like a bill focused on both mitigation and preparedness, everything was insignificant. And this did not seem to be a factor influencing the passage of these bills. We then looked at who the bill was supposed to help or what the bill was supposed to do. We looked at whether the bill was about a holiday or memorial, like Wildfire Preparedness Week. We looked at whether the bill was about a specific geographic region, like a county or a watershed that might have been affected by a fire, and also a vulnerable or disadvantaged population or no specific population. We found that holiday bills did better. They were more likely to pass. It might be kind of hard to vote against Wildfire Preparedness Week. And bills that were about specific regions also were more likely to pass. But vulnerable or disadvantaged populations did not have an advantage, or bills about vulnerable or disadvantaged populations, the p-value was almost 1. There was no distinction between these two, which is really interesting given California's focus or desire to have more attention on communities particularly affected by wildfires and other disasters. So then the fifth topic, or the fifth hypothesis, was that it might be the topic itself that influences passage. The bills that are about a specific issue might have a better chance of moving through the legislature. So we tested all of these and that, a couple of things were significant, nothing really, and again, pretty small sample sizes. Only 7 bills were about frozen crops. They had 100% pass rate. Again, not necessarily the solution to getting all wildfire bills passed. But what was interesting was that greenhouse gases bills had a lower likelihood of getting passed than other bills. But we can't necessarily take a lot from this. And then my last hypothesis, which kind of brings me back to Derek's original question, and what I'd really appreciate some help with this group from, is how to think about these bills with repetitive language. With the idea that if you propose a bill in 2006 about prescribed burns and it failed, and then you reiterate it, and you propose a slightly revised version of that bill in 2008, and that also fails. And then you propose a revised version of that bill in 2010, and it passes. Can we count the other 2 bills as failures, or are they just iterations moving forward? Should we only be thinking about the final language of these bills? Should we be looking at these bills separately, together? Kind of how to think about this at all. And then another situation you might face is that maybe 4 legislators proposed bills about prescribed burns in 2006. 3 of those bills failed maybe very early on because the language from those 3 bills combined with a 4th bill to make a super prescribed burns bill, and that bill passed. And then do we necessarily say that these other 3 bills failed if the language from them ended up passing in the end, maybe even in the same legislative session? And to start thinking about this, I've been using this program called WCopyFind. So I've got each of these bills in a separate Word document, and I've been uploading them to compare across from each other. So this is AB 2444, which was proposed in 2020, or the 2019 to 2020 legislative session. And it has a 51% overlap with AB 41, which has a 3% overlap with it. And so I can sort of quantify how much overlap these bills have with each other and come up with some sort of threshold that maybe the bill has to be a 50% duplicate or match to count as being a replicated bill. And it ends up looking like this. This is kind of the result of this process where it kind of matches out how much of the language is being repeated. But I kind of think that this might be part of the way to get bills passed. And I'm not entirely sure how to track this or quantify this in some way to actually test this hypothesis. So suggestions from the group would be very, very welcome. Oh, there's a chat. I don't know. Do revised bills typically have the same sponsor? Sometimes yes, but sometimes no. So it can be hard to tell. Some of them get proposed multiple times from the same person, but then sometimes that person might switch to the Senate. So you kind of have to trace them if they've gone from the Assembly to the Senate or vice versa. And it's not, and sometimes language gets picked up by another legislator. So it's not always a perfect match, especially if we're talking about this type of example in which maybe they've become co-sponsors, but also maybe they haven't become co-sponsors. So it can end up being a little complicated to track that. Okay, so basically there are some factors that might influence bill passage. It's kind of just a summary of what I just showed you, but there's a lot of things that are inconclusive. And then really quickly, I just want to fly through this. We also looked at just the failed bills themselves to see if maybe there's something that we can understand about why these bills are making it farther or less far through the process of becoming a bill. Because bills can fail at any stage of the legislative process. They can fail in the very first house where they get proposed. They can fail in the second house where they're proposed. They can fail at what's called the resolution of difference stage, in which the Senate and the Assembly bills are reworked to make sure the language is the same. And then they can also fail because they might get vetoed by the governor. And what we found is that most of the bills fail quite early on in the process. That's the lightest blue that you see. Failing in the second house is the second most common, and then getting vetoed is also common. And there's kind of another question of, should we consider a bill that got vetoed to pass because it made it through the legislature, even if it didn't have executive approval? So that's kind of another thing to think about. But most of these bills fell fairly early. So is there something about the bills that can move through the legislature farther? And I did the exact same 6 hypotheses or 5 hypotheses. Find the bill sponsor makes no difference. None of these factors were significant. The number of committees made a difference, just like in the previous analysis, looking at passed versus failed bills. Some of the committees made a difference, but not a ton. And they were also different committees than in the previous analysis. But some of them can actually move it forward a full house or a full stage in the process, like budget, environmental safety, and quality. Again, probably not a perfect solution for bills. The disaster stage, again, made no difference. The impacted population made no difference. And there were a few topics that made a difference, but again, we're talking about pretty small numbers, probably nothing very conclusive here. So a lot of it's still a little unknown. And again, it might come back to this repetitive language question. We can look at some of the individual topics themselves. So like I did this with the field treatments topic, it was the largest topic here. And there were some different things that popped up for this particular topic, rather than some of the other ones, like being from a rural district actually made your bill less likely to pass about fuel treatments. But female legislators were able to move their bill more forward than male legislators among bills that failed. So a lot of this still remains unknown, and I'd love your help with all of this. In the future, we're gonna do interviews with people from Sacramento to talk about some of the other factors that might be affecting passage or failure of these bills, including things like, do the sponsors get along with people? Do they have good relationships? Could that make a difference? Whether some of these bills are passing or failing because they're not politically or legally viable. Like maybe they're just poorly written bills and we can't see that from our analysis, but that's why they're not moving forward. Or even it might be a great bill, but it costs way too much to be implemented. And so it doesn't pass because of budget constraints. And the goal is, once we figure this out, maybe to repeat this across the rest of the Western United States and think about how other states are thinking about wildfire legislation, to see if there are differences in how California is tackling this problem versus a more Republican state like Montana or Idaho, or even other Democratic states like Oregon and Washington. And we can also do this for other types of disasters. So these are all the different types of disasters. I've already pulled summary text for all of these over the last 10 legislative sessions. And some of the big ones in California are like droughts and earthquakes and floods and wildfires. And some of them are much more consistent, like drought and wildfires have really kind of blown up recently, but floods and earthquakes remain fairly steady. And so we might be seeing more consistent bill topics for some of these disasters than for others that are affecting California more recently, like drought and wildfires. So with that, I'm going to close up, but I would love some feedback or some thoughts from people about how to do something with this research, most of which is inconclusive right now.
Rebecca, that was fantastic. I hadn't kept up with this recent work, and I'm pretty impressed and also a little overwhelmed by all the possibilities. So I'll open the floor for questions, and if I can consolidate my thoughts, I'll give you a couple questions at the end.
Well, I'll jump in. I think to some extent, there are two things that are kind of missing here that may be problematic for you. One of them is, I mean, you don't really use your time, your incidents, right? And clearly the attention to wildfires really developed in the second part of that series. And somehow that's not getting captured in your modeling. So that's one problem. I mean, it's obviously the fact that it's going to cost us $1 billion or more, $1.5 billion, impinges on a lot of other programs. And so the mere fact that we have to spend so much money on suppression is now starting to squeeze all the other things we have to do in this state, not just in climate change. And that leads me to the second thing, which is that we don't really get a good sense of who's voting for these and who's voting against. I mean, it's great to know who sponsors them, and there's things to be learned from that. But I think the real key question that's going to push this forward is who is voting against it. What are the blocks that are voting against it? Now, some of it is Republican. You got that part. But I think there's urban, rural. There's there could be wealthy, poor counties. I don't, districts or whatever. But I think sort of unpacking why these bills fail is going to require you to know a little bit more about the actual votes, who voted for and against, who consistently voted against all these things, who were the swing votes.
Do you think that that's more important in the committees, which will be easier to track, hopefully, than the full?
That's actually a good question. And here you suffer that I haven't been working in this area as much as I did 20 years ago, 15 years ago. One of the things that we studied was what happened when term limits came in, and what happened. And it basically, it's a very complicated, long story that I don't want to bore everybody with. But the short end of it is that the committee capacity got undercut as a result of term limits. And so the staff expertise, et cetera, and everything went away. And the power got centralized more in the speaker's office, which is a very long way of saying I don't think that was what was going on. It would be more on whether their floor votes were there, whether the governor was behind it, how it impacted other, particularly bills that would cost money. I mean, one of your findings is that the ceremonial bills go right through. Okay, well, that one is a no-brainer. It's just like everything else, but the willingness to pay is the key thing. And then it becomes competitive with all the other money in the budget. So when you think about it, there's a lot of things that have to be controlled here, not only the wildfire expenses, but what's the status of the budget in that particular year? Are we in the middle of a recession or not? Or, so the second thing I wanted to say, so I do think you have to get more into the politics and particularly to focus on who voted for it and who didn't, and which interest groups are aligned on what side on this, okay? And then I think that could uncover this, and you'll get some of that from your interviews, right? So I do want to say, though, that one finding that I think is quite striking that fits with some of the other work that we've seen, both in this seminar and work that we've done in the Lane Center, is it was kind of interesting that wildfire smoke bills didn't get much support. And this gets to something I've said to Marshall a couple of times, which is that our polling data suggests that people are really not aware of what Carrie and Mary know. Okay, they have no idea of it. Plus, the length and duration of these wildfire smoke events in the last few years has been something that we've never seen before. And so they don't really understand that 3 weeks of exposure is like, multiple packs of cigarettes in your lungs, particularly if you don't in the right kind of buildings. So it really, I think, but I think that's a striking finding. It is a little, I suspect it's interesting. The other interesting finding is that you find that people that have fires in their district are likely to put these bills forward, but you really, what you need to do is have a majority, right? And so there aren't enough of these legislators that have fires. The fires, maybe over time, everybody, or not everybody, but a fair number of them would, but at any moment in time, it's only a small number of districts. So it's hard to get a coalition together to get something passed. That's why the wildfire smoke is distressing, because that one actually does affect a lot of districts. And but there you have an ignorance problem. So you got a salience, you got the right salience, but a small number of districts with respect to the fires, and then you got low salience, but a potentially broader coalition with respect to the wildfire smoke. So it's an interesting political problem that may depend upon how much education we get out there about what we're doing. And I think this is something we as a wildfire group, Derek, have to think about. How do we get some of the things that we're finding out there to people so that they recognize the health consequences of this? And I think what Rebecca has shows that it's pretty important, because people don't recognize it. As far as I can tell, if you take the evidence of what she's got, these bills are not going anywhere because people don't understand that it's not, it's not a minor thing. So anyway, I think it's, I wouldn't get discouraged. Good projects often have require you to get deeper and deeper. And so you just have to get a little deeper on this. But I think you've already got a couple interesting things with the scraping. But now, your skills are that you can do both the scraping and you can do the interviewing. So you're going to learn a lot, get in there and find out what the political coalitions are that are stopping some of these bills.
That's the goal. And I think, Bruce, just on your point about smoke, I would not be surprised. I haven't looked at the recent bills that have come forward in this session, but I wouldn't be surprised if there's a lot more bills on smoke because of the fires from last summer. But again, I don't know if they're going to pass. Yeah.
Well, again, a lot of it should tie into what Marshall and Iris and others are doing, looking at the actual levels of smoke exposure, because my sense is that it was very intense up in Northern California, but it wasn't quite as intense in Southern California. There were some isolated places where it was, but not, I don't think downtown LA was suffering the way San Francisco was. So.
Great comments, Bruce. And yeah, I'm encouraged by the work you're doing, Rebecca. I think there's a lot more. This could be a ton of PhD theses just in different avenues. And I don't know much about the politics of Sacramento, but I was discouraged to see that smoke came up with a big goose egg in terms of passing. But I'm hoping your optimism is a little bit right about the future. One thing to piggyback on what Bruce talked about was I am wondering if there is available information just on how different politicians vote in general. So and that's another data scraping level, but like, what's the track record of voting? And maybe the easier question that came to mind was, what is the success rate of other bills unrelated to wildfires? Is that easy to scrape that out? So is it just, do you bombard the legislature with enough bills so that you will get 40% of them through, or is the passage rate of wildfire legislature on par with other ones or much less? And then the big $1 billion question or $1.5 billion question is, I do think cost has to come into play, right? So if you sort those and based on cost classification, I'm wondering what you would find in terms of passage and failure. Like, is it expensive or cheap? If it makes sense to people, right, and it's inexpensive, does that give you a statistically significant higher passage rate than expensive and recognizably important things?
So this is a really tricky question. It's something that I definitely agree with. And some of these bills have analyses of how expensive they would be, but it's things like this would be between $100 million and $1 billion. And they'll give a range that's so big as to be meaningless. And I'm trying to figure out, that's partially why I feel like I have to go to these interviews to get better sense of what this would actually cost, because not all these bills get financial analyses, budget analysis. And also when the range is so ridiculous, I can't do anything with that.
Well, you could treat it separately, where treat it as a variance variable. In other words, that shows you the level of uncertainty.
Okay.
And how people react to uncertainty could be a factor in that. So
Okay.
Never throw away information. You never know.
Well, it's also me. I can't tell you how many times I've gone to the state website and copied information, as every time I realize, oh, I need to see if it was co-sponsored, and then it's rechecking 294 bills manually.
But remember what I always say, the advantage that we have over the scientists is we can talk to our data points. They may lie to us. So we don't take everything they say at face value, but at least we could talk to them and get some clues.
True.
And you're good at that. So I think it's just time to flip on that other side, talk to your data points. And if physicists could talk to a quark, wow, man, they'd be in great shape. But, you know, we need to sort of figure out, you know, what the dynamics are, get little hints from that, and then bounce back and do the empirical work and see if that's true.
Mm-hmm.
Great suggestions. Other comments or questions from the rest of the audience?
Hey, Rebecca. My name is Stephanie, and this is my first time here, so thank you, everyone. And this was a great presentation. Thank you very much. Quick question, like, have you considered independent outcome variables besides bill passage and failure? Because, like, as you noted, this framing implies that passing is good and failure is bad, but then you ended by kind of noting that the bill quality may vary. So I wonder if maybe there are some other independent outcome variables from the bill or the political process that, I don't know, you could relate.
Yeah, that's a great question. And Bruce, maybe you know an answer to this, because I don't know if there's like how you know, bills get rankings from the federal government of like, this gets a B- from the NRA or whatever. And I wonder if there's a way to track ratings from bills from, you know, environmental agencies or something.
No, there typically are. Yeah, there are industry ratings, and then political scientists have come up with their own ratings, largely done on the Congress, but people have also done it on state legislatures. And the name of the scholar who may have done it in California is escaping me now. It'll come to me at some point in the middle of the night. But
okay, well, I'll get an email from you in the middle of the night.
Yeah, exactly. But there's somebody. There are people that have done this sort of thing. So
Jeff Lewis.
Yeah.
From IRIS.
Well. See, there you go. Iris is my brain.
Okay. So there's a way to kind of see how good the bill is.
Yeah, Iris can help you out on that. There's a lot of work on that, and you don't want to have to redo things, but I think that could be.
Yeah, and I guess one more thought. I guess I'm not familiar that much with like the insurance industry, but I wonder if maybe like insurance costs and payouts could be a way to quantify like the need for these bills or something like that. Mm-hmm. Or maybe if there are public opinion polls, like maybe politicians pay attention to that.
Yeah.
They do.
I haven't looked at public opinion polls. I did separately look at newspaper mentions, so media mentions on this, and both national and state level papers mentions of wildfires do prompt more attention, but they don't affect how many of these bills actually pass.
Hi, I'm Jan Martinez, and I haven't visited before either, but I'm looking with Paul Brast at Wildfire and trying to design a mapping system on social policy change. The one thing that popped to my head, Rebecca, is the parallel of federal legislation on these topics. And I can't remember the proportion of federal governance over forested land versus state, but whether there is or isn't parallel legislation in the Congress that would affect the state legislation.
Yeah, so federal government owns like 57% of the state's forests. I have looked a little bit at what the federal government's proposed on this, but a lot of those bills have not passed, like kind of the ones that really could make a difference have not passed. And I don't know how much of a parallel, I mean, it's possible there might be something. There's some definitely attention on things like prescribed burns, and some on defensible space and home hardening, but it's not too much more that I've found. But I can take a look and see what other bills have been proposed.
Or smoke, I mean, air quality.
Yeah.
Clearly,
Well,
they're going the wrong direction.
right.
But that, especially with the smoke,
Yeah,
you think that might, and the air, of course, doesn't know where it lives.
right. And that actually might get more attention from
Yeah.
federal legislators as it crosses different jurisdiction, state
Yeah.
boundaries or something. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, sure.
Yeah, great comments and questions. We are at 1:22. So I know we are at the end here, but I'd like to open it up for one final question or a closing comment from our audience.
Well, I'll just throw out an idea that you should look at, which is, and it goes actually follows on what Janet was talking about, which is, as you know, CARB is basically restricted to working with mobile emissions and cannot deal with stationary emissions. And the reason that we can't fix that and give CARB authority over stationary is that local governments control land use jealously. And a lot of what you're talking about in terms of prescriptive burns or other kinds, or home hardening or vegetation management, are responsibilities that local governments care about. So I do think that as you get into the politics of this, you should see how much of this, it won't all be an explanation, but an element of this I suspect is going to be local governments being suspicious of letting the state have more control over private land use, or usurping powers. I think basically what the local governments want is for the state to give them grant money and not more regulatory authority. So I don't know. I just throw that in as a possible hypothesis to look at,
But I could look for, state funded, unfunded state mandate or something like that.
Which they hate, as you know, they hate.
And see if those bills pass or fail.
Yeah.
Or more likely to or something. Yeah.
But just something along that line, that unfunded mandate is a great idea versus the ones where they give you money, a bond measure or whatever. That's more likely to be in a bond than it will be in a piece of legislation. And the locals will never say no to the money, but the unfunded mandates, they hate with a passion. Yeah. So
back to the 294 bills.
Yeah, that's it. That's your fate, Rebecca.
One more time through.
At least.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Well, thank you for a really stimulating talk and discussion today, Rebecca. We will close out our seminar series next week with Iris Hoy, and she's going to continue us along this path of scraping and hopefully getting some great interpretations as she talks about using public records to study wildfire. So stay tuned and hope to see you next week. And thanks again, Rebecca, and all the great comments. We'll see you again soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Rebecca.